1/5 of migratory species are at risk from going extinct. We're going to talk about on today's episode of Ocean Talk. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ocean Talk. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is where I talk all things ocean so you can be more aware of what's happening in the ocean and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. A new report was just released about migratory species on the face of the planet. So that is land, freshwater, and saltwater. And we're looking at a very dim outcome. 1/5 of migratory species are at risk from going extinct. When we talk about oceans and migratory species, we're looking at sharks like whale sharks, even manta rays. We're looking at mola molas. We're looking at whales. That includes dolphins and orcas. We're looking at sea turtles. All of those species are at risk in some sort of capacity. We're talking about salmon. We're talking about a lot of other species. So this is going to be really, really important to listen. If you're interested in the ocean, you want to protect the ocean, protecting migratory species is going to be one of the biggest things that we need to do to protect those species and the ocean. The report looked at 1,189 species in total, which like I said before, covered land, freshwater, and saltwater. 44% of those species have seen a decline over the past number of years, and 22% of the species can vanish altogether at any point. This is the first ever report on migratory species. It was published last Monday in the middle of February, and a lot of the numbers were given by the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the Living Planet Index. The two causes of this potential extinction of 1/5 of these migratory species were exploitation and habitat destruction. So obviously this is something that is, worldwide. Migratory species like whale sharks and manta rays and sharks, as well as dolphins and orcas and baleen whales, sea turtles, they travel all over the world. So this is not just for North America. It's not just for European waters, not just for Australian waters or Asian waters or African waters or South American waters, Antarctic waters. This is for the entire planet. This is something that is a wake-up call to say a lot of these migratory species that are extremely important to the ocean, right? A lot of them are apex predators. Some of these animals regulate the waters in which they inhabit. Others will provide food for those habitats, and others will contribute to the habitats in various ways. The key thing here is how do we protect migratory species? This is something that's been a huge question since back in 2000 when I was doing my graduate work and we were talking about the census of marine life. Now, the census of marine life was all about looking at where ocean species, especially migratory species, go in the ocean. So this is where like the dawn of tagging happened. We had other tags where, people had tags with numbers on them, and then, a sea turtle or a tag would pop up in somewhere. They would be released, say in North America, and it would pop up in Japan, and they would read that tag and they would go online to a listserv. And I remember seeing on the sea turtle list, like, hey, who has tag such and such number? And somebody would be like, oh, that's my tag. Where did you find it? Well, it was found off the coast of Japan in this area. And, this is how far this sea turtle traveled. Oh, that's interesting. I tagged that sea turtle back in Baja, California. Oh, interesting. So this is when we started to know that species started to migrate quite far. And actually, Dr. Wallace J. Nichols was one of the first people to tag, put GPS unit on a sea turtle and found out that it went from Baja, California to Japan. That's how far some of these animals travel. And the Census of Marine Life revealed a lot of other species like whale sharks and other different types of sharks, manta rays, and it's still in the shark order, looking at whales and some fish like salmon and stuff. Things that were tagged, we saw these large migratory pathways, great white sharks and stuff. We're starting to see, hey, this is where they live, and now we're really starting to get to know their distribution and understanding when they need to be protected and where they need to be protected and where they're most vulnerable. So all this information from satellite tags and old GPS units and even all those old school tags that you just tag on a sea turtle or on a shark or on a whale, and it would just pop off somewhere, go to shore, and people would actually pick it up and be like, hey, where's the tag from? I found this tag. We've been able to get a lot of information and find out where species go, identify specific nursery habitat. Just the other week, we found a potential area where great white sharks are born. There's a lot of information that's coming out from these distribution studies to give us answers and where certain species need to be protected, especially when they're migratory species. And to understand why it's so troublesome to protect migratory species, we need to start looking at species that stay within the same vicinity. I call them like resident species, right? This is like halibut, haddock, cod, all these types of demersal species. These species kind of hang out at the bottom of the ocean. They like to hang out in a specific area. And like my graduate work was actually on this in master's, but it was all about, invertebrate species, macro invertebrate species like crabs, shrimps, squid, and so forth. And we looked at where these specific assemblages of species would be along the Scotian Shelf and Bay of Fundy. And we noticed that there'd be 4 distinct assemblages. So 4 combinations of animals that would hang out, and they would be like a community, and they would have specific habitats. They'd have a specific temperature, a specific depth, sometimes a specific salinity. And then we'd look at other factors like the bottom depth and what it would be like if it was on a bank, if it wasn't on a bank, and to see what the sediment would be like if we had that information. And we put all that information together. That would be able to inform people who are putting together networks of marine protected areas, because with networks of marine protected areas, which is something that can protect habitats of not only residential species, but migratory species, which I'll get into in a second, we were able to find out how big those protected areas had to be and where they needed to be. Were they in areas where it was just that assemblage? Was it in areas where those assemblages would overlap? All these different types of things would be able to be put into consideration when they're put into this massive database and massive program to select where the best networks of marine protected areas would be. Like, where would those little pieces of protected areas be and how they would connect, and we'd figure that out afterwards. Now, with migratory species, it's a little more difficult because they go from place to place at different times of the year. They're not always in the same area multiple times a year. They're in different parts and for different reasons. Sometimes it's like there's an upwelling, in the mid-Atlantic, and they have to find it and they have to get to it so they can feed. Sometimes it's an area where like, oh, we're gonna go breed, like humpback whales will go to Hawaii or Maui to breed, and they would go there and they would have their young and have their calves, and they would travel up to the Arctic when it was time for the summer to go for the summer's eating. And we know the general pathways that most species take now, although some are still mysterious to us. Some are still a mystery for us, but we're starting to figure that out through tagging and through better research and people concentrating on different species, especially those larger migratory species. But every time they stop, that's a potential area that you could protect. You're not going to protect the entire hallway. It's very difficult to protect that because that could be hundreds of thousands of kilometers apart. So what we're looking to do is looking at distinct areas of upwelling, areas where there's a nursery, areas where it's like a spawning site, say for salmon, like river systems and so forth, and protect those areas so that every time they come to those areas are protected. So if they need to feed, they're going to have places to feed without being harmed, without fishing pressures, without any lines to get entangled for larger species like whales and so forth. So all those things come into play, right, when we look at distinctive areas for migratory species, but those need to be protected. They're not easy to identify, they're not easy to track, they don't always happen at the same time, and what's even more difficult now is things are changing. All the things that we predicted a while ago as scientists with climate change, changes in currents, changes in upwelling areas, changes in temperature, it's all affecting migratory paths. And so now we have to find out where those paths are changing and do more research to catch up to find where those marine protected areas need to go for those large migratory species. And then the other thing is we have to stop the overexploitation of species. We're seeing a lot of whales who are close to being extinct, like say the North Atlantic right whale, continue to be caught in fishing gear and being entangled by them and then eventually dying. We're seeing ship strikes to continue to happen. All these things need to be reevaluated to protect species that are especially very vulnerable to going extinct, like the North Atlantic right whale. There are other whales, there are other shark species, there are other migratory species that need to be protected. Climate change is throwing a wrench in it. Overexploitation is throwing a wrench in it, making sure that we're catching up to finding out where these distinctive protected areas need to go in. It's a lot of work. And so we need people like yourself who's interested in protecting the ocean. You may not have a career in marine biology or marine conservation, but you're interested. Talk to your politicians, your local politicians, talk to your NGOs, your nonprofit organizations that are working with the environment. See how you can help. Make sure you're putting pressure on your local politicians, your provincial or state politicians, and your federal politicians to ensure that we are getting the right protections in place. A lot of countries have signed on to the 30 by 30 for protecting areas. Canada, US, the UK, Australia, and many other countries are also involved in this. So make sure that your politicians are following those and make sure that you are being able to track it and it's available to everybody in your country. So that's it for today's episode. Obviously a topic that can be very alarming, but let's work together. Let's work with nonprofit organizations. Let's work with our politicians to make sure that we are getting on the right track and we're protecting 1/5 of these migratory species and all of these migratory species that are at risk from going extinct. Let me know what you think about this episode and this topic in the description below. I'm really interested to read your comments, to find out what you think about this, because let's be honest, this is the beginning of a conversation. I'd love to interact with you in the comments section. And if you want to hear more about oceans and how to protect them, you can go and listen to my How to Protect the Ocean podcast, an audio podcast that you can have on the run. And all you have to do is just go to your favorite podcast app, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're on most platforms. You can just check it out just by subscribing or following, and let me know when you do. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you back here in the comment section. Just let me know if you've subscribed or followed or listened to my episodes on your favorite podcast app. So thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Ocean Talk. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.